and use the chat and all of that. This isn't necessarily that we know all the answers to this. This is where, where we've got in our findings and the kinds of issues we've come across and thought about in this. So that's a menu of the things that I'm hoping we can go through today. I've said important dates. Well, maybe there's just one. It's the 31st of December 2020, and that's the end of support of shibless IDP v3. And I understand that's not just because of the shibless project, but because of one of the dependencies that is used within that, and therefore, it's being driven by that. IDP v4 or 4.01 is the current stable release. So if you were waiting for the first service pack, sorry, Windows joke, but there we are. It's there. Oh no, 31st of December. Sorry, British joke, but it's the end of the Brexit transition period too. So the requirements for v4 are, as I understand it from reading the system requirements, is Amazon Corretto 11 on Linux or Windows. We're already directing people towards Corretto for Windows deployments. And then Red Hat's Open JDK 11 for Linux as supplied under Red Hat Enterprise. And then there's partial support for Open JDK 11 under Debian. I guess we'll find a lot of people are using 8, and it'd be quite interesting to see what people are thinking about here in terms of what they have already. And then the web servlet container, the requirements of Tomcat 9, Jetty 9.4, and again, in our findings, I think a few people are short of that mark. And as I think Scott has reminded us in other channels, and these will work with v3 too. So you can get all these components in place beforehand while still running v3. So I think hopefully the Windows deployers maybe have an easier ride here, which is that their main dependency is Java 11, and the only option there in that requirements is to use Corretto. So there's not a lot to think about. So hopefully that's just take that route. You need the Visual C++ redistributable packages for Visual Studio 2015, 2017, and 2019. Otherwise, and I'm sure Matthew will testify this, as will probably Rod and anyone else from the shibless project, which was that, yes, you get a rather interesting error message that doesn't mean anything to anyone if you try to
much head scratching.
Yes, and much head scratching. So yes, definitely put that on the list of things to install. And of course, Jetty is dealt with by the shibless installer, so you don't need to think about that terribly much. But watch out for any customizations. If you've done anything outside of, I think it's the Jetty base folder, that customizations are in there that you would normally make. If you've done anything outside of that, watch out for that, because obviously that will get overwritten. That's that's the default behavior, but that's just that's just some of our finding. And Steve Glover in the Federation team sort of alerted me to that one. For the Linux deployers, then the Java and Java Web Container needs to be considered, and it's probably likely, and we were talking about health checks earlier in the week, that you are running things that are slightly older than the versions that are the requirements for v4. And if they're deployed from source, then that's great. You've got the current version as of today, but how do you manage security updates? And that's always a consideration for people. So you'll have to think about that. Are they deployed from the OS repo? So if you've grabbed the version that's in CentOS, then you can get your security updates, but you're tied to the OS version. So we found this one with, say, CentOS 7, is that you're now tied to Tomcat 7, which is rather old. So the upgrade path and deprecation warnings, our recommended upgrade path, if anyone's there on 3 point something, but it's not 3.4.6, then get to 3.4.6. Fix your deprecation warnings. We've got documentation there. And there's also the documentation on the Shibboleth wiki. And then get to 4.01 or 4.0, whatever is out there when you come to do this, but obviously today, 4.01. So these are some of the things we've sort of thought about as you're trying to think about IDP v3 to 4. So the attribute resolver is likely to be the main source of your deprecation warnings. All attribute definitions are likely to need an update because of the change from dependency to input data connector, etc. There's going to be more changes for anyone who's upgraded to v2 to v3, so the deprecated namespaces may come up in this scenario. And a general direction of travel, which is not necessarily directly related to IDP v4, but we are trying to move and encourage people away from scripted attributes towards mapped attributes where they can, because these seem to be, more portable, less likely to break during an upgrade. So related to National JavaScript engine and Java 15, that's going to become a problem. And we've seen this. It was previously tricky with Rhino to National upgrades, which we've seen within sort of the v2 to v3 space when people were moving from, say, Java 7 to 8 and things like that. So we've got an example for mapped affiliation there on the Federation website if anyone's looking at that, which is using mapped attributes to do eduperson scoped affiliation and eduperson affiliation, which seems to be the most common scenario that we come across. It's not the only one. You could build on that. And again, when we're talking about v2 to v3, if you've done that process, then you might find your attribute filter is again using deprecated namespace, the AFP namespace. And the last one is a general good practice, but move the salt values out to the attribute resolver. You need to keep your salt a secret, and you don't want to reveal that. And often we may ask you, or we may ask somebody who succeeds you, to send us their attribute resolver file as part of a support request. And whilst we would always try to say, take out any secret values, etc., before you send that to us, that doesn't always happen. And there's no way out if you've disclosed your salt value. And then for new installs of v4, and it's unlikely that you will have. It's unlikely that many will, in this space now will be going direct for an install of v4, but some people will, and you might need to rebuild or whatever. So it's worth talking about some of these things. So I've been looking at the attribute resolver LDAP XML as a base, and it has good examples in there, and it seems to be really the way we want it to go. So only needs eduperson target ID for operation in the UK Federation, because that's predominantly used. That's eduperson target ID as a SAML2 persistent name identifier sent as an attribute. It already has the computed ID connector in there. The salt's now out of the attribute resolver, so that's now in a secrets.properties, I think it is, within credentials, which is really good to get all that stuff out into there. And it's also got the examples for the new subject identifier attributes, which are kind of the successors to eduperson targeted ID. The one to be careful of is this encryption defaults, because that move from CBC to GCM, a lot of SPs in the Federation will still be using CBC. They won't have algorithm agility because that's only a feature of the Shibboleth software. It's not generally available in any other software, so therefore they need CBC. So you may need to roll back that default. And I put pending other UK Federation changes because I don't know if what we will do in that space. We may make changes in the future to try and accommodate some of this. And there's some documentation there on those aspects. So the kinds of things you might want to think about, I don't know if anyone's looking at containerization and automation. I'm quite interested in this area ourselves. So for us, we're already using Ansible playbooks for things like consultancy work. And then we've got ongoing work for containerization, looking at Docker containers. And there's a bit of a challenge here of immutable containers versus this upgrade path from V3 to V4. So we've got to sort of think about the V4 and how to make it, to deploy it afresh, but make it behave how we need in the legacy sort of way of V3. And then where are we with guides on the Federation website? Well, we've got the setup IDP3 guide is now deprecated, really. It really covers the early versions of V3. We've got a guide that covers Windows. That's in quite good health as things go. And you know, I've tested it on 3.4.6 and it's still valid on that. So I think the new, you know, the things we've got to do as a Federation support team is now look at what we need to do for V4. So, you know, a new deployer's guide, an upgraders guide. You know, which of those is a priority? Probably the upgraders guide, but I would find that probably the deployer's guide is actually easier to push out there. It's very unlikely that we'll advocate the fresh IDP guidance that we had for V2 to V3. So in that process, we suggested that most people rebuild their systems on V3 and get it to behave like their, you know, like their existing IDP. However, given the Shibboleth project's advice to upgrade in place, then we'd recommend that. You may not do a direct in-place upgrade because, you know, you have the other components around. So you may have to take the Shibboleth installation and port it to another virtual machine or another container or something like that, rather than just doing it in place on the host as it stands. And when should we get that guidance out there? Well, we need to get that out there ASAP, I understand, but if anyone has any feedback on, you know, their priorities and things like that, we can try to understand that and prioritize that accordingly. And that's me done. I can see there's been some discussion in the chat.
Mostly just a question about using, the only real question was related to salts that aren't property friendly, which I noted. I think we've fixed all of the edge cases, and you can encode your salt with base 64, and if you need to use a property for it, and that should work across the board in all the various places it shows up. So I think that's
okay.
been dealt with.
That's good. Yeah, so we've seen other software uses the salt base 64 encoded as well. Yeah. So shall I go through the chat? So yeah, Steve's just pointed out that the bit that he lost in his Windows IDP Jetty was he'd made to tweak. Was the file called tweak-ssl.xml.
Yes, editing ciphers and things like that.
Yeah.
Honestly, yeah. I mean, this came up in a thread on the dev list, and I mean, people have been advocating for, you know, why don't you just embed a container in all of your distributions? And what they really mean by that is, why don't you just spin it up internally using code and basically just run it Spring Boot style, where it just spins up a web server. And you know, the basic answer is, if you're going to do that, then what that is basically saying is, we're not the web server, we're an appliance that you put behind your own web server proxy load balancer, you know, whether it be Apache or Nginx or, you know, any of the, or a Netscaler or any of the alternatives. And honestly, the whole point was to not force people to have to do that out of the box. Yeah. And that's where the problems come in, because to keep a secure web server operating with a decent grade, you have to be able to make adjustments. And while we can try to keep up as best we can, that's always going to be a challenge for us to be shipping the right configurations. And so, you know, it's a double-edged sword. And I think I would say, if you're going to run the Windows installer version of Jetty, you're kind of implying that you're sticking it behind your own infrastructure somewhere that is really the front end. And if you don't want to do that, I would really just run Jetty yourself, and configure it however you want to. And you can use our Jetty base, which is the same thing that we ship inside the Windows package. You can install it and tweak it to your heart's content, and upgrades are quite simple, at least within the same Jetty releases. 9.3 to 9.4 is not fun, but I mean, within 9.4 itself, I mean, it's been relatively fine. So, I mean, I think that's kind of where it's at, is the out-of-the-box thing works great, but it isn't really meant to be a web server that you would expose to the internet any more than you would with a Spring Boot app or anything else that comes like that.
That's an that's an interesting thought and take on that, because the scenarios we've seen often where people have load balancers and reverse proxies is when we're looking at issues that people have is that the IDPs that are not behind the load balancers are not the ones that have the issues, and that often their security issues are created by these load balancers and reverse proxies and things like that, and they actually score worse compared to a ship's configuration.
Not untrue. That's not untrue. I wouldn't say NetScalers have a great track record either, but you know, the point is, you know, if you have infrastructure teams that are responsible for Apache, at least you can go complain to them and tell them to fix the configuration if you don't like the way that it's set up. But you know, what we ship, even Jetty itself is constantly arguing about what ciphers they should be shipping it with. And somebody actually came recently and bitched about a bug that we had commented on, where we tried to get them to lock things down a little bit more because they were auto installing a bunch of really weak ciphers if you didn't do things a certain way. And the guy came along and basically said, you know, it's not their responsibility to come up with a secure configuration. That's up to the deployer, and he needs to be able to set it wherever he wants to set it. And you shouldn't be making these assumptions and blah, blah, blah. It's like, that's the tension, right? And so I don't think there's a good answer. And I don't think the Jetty project will end up in a good place in the long run, because they're eventually just going to punt it and say, you know, it's the deployer's responsibility. And so, you know, if you're going to run these sorts of automated versions of it, I think you almost have an obligation to stick something in front of it that you have tighter control over. And if that's bad too, well, then, you know, you've got somewhere else to point the finger.
Okay.
But to be clear, I run it natively. I run it directly. Our load balancer is just a pass through. So I use Jetty as the sole entity, the sole system, but I run it. I mean, I maintain it myself, and it uses my own configuration. And so, you know, I have a tweak SSL myself. You know, as a result, I don't lose it during upgrades because I'm not using a shib to update that piece.
Yeah. Thanks. Anyone else have any questions, comments, things they'd like to discuss in this area?
Maybe anyone else who's already done this and has found some other gotchas that we haven't found yet?
Yeah, I did mine last month. I can't say that I did anything differently than what you covered. I had already fixed most of the warnings. Most of them were not terribly important. I could have left them, but I had a long enough lag time between the time that I started testing and the time that I ended up going live that I had already fixed most of them. But most of them aren't really terribly important if they're not removed features. Of course, there were some that are actually removed features, but the point being, you'll get some warnings after you upgrade to V4, because by design it's flagging additional things that are going to go away later. And so those are the ones that are sort of, I mean, they're annoying, but they're certainly not essential to fix to go live. And I upgraded, you know, straight over top as we document. That's certainly how it's intended to work.
Okay. I see we've got one comment. Andy says he's installed V4 on CentOS 7. Got it working on CentOS 7.
Out of interest, Andy, what container are you using that on? if Andy is still there.
Yep.
He is. He's in the participant list.
I've got 9, as recommended.
By the way, the Red Hat Java support statement applies to CentOS as well. I don't know if our language is inclusive or not. It should be. If it's not, I can take a look. But I mean, I certainly run it on CentOS. They're obviously the same code.
Yeah, I think it does. I think the system requirements for v4 does say Red Hat Enterprise. So. And Andy said, send us 8 next, as we want to look at Docker containers. So many other people, I didn't hear many things about containers and automation. I don't know if many are using any of those things to deploy their IDP.
I'm a virulent Luddite, so I do not.
And we're using a very old system called LCFG for our current deployment. Some people may have heard of that. Maybe the only people in the world using it. We're looking at moving towards Puppet for our deployments in future. But that's only managing the sort of base install and the Apache configuration. The actual shibboleth configuration files are just kept in a separate subversion or Git repo. We'll probably move that to Git as well when we move to Puppet. So we kind of deploy the same configuration across all our IDPs, and we've got test dev live. But I think that's, well, we haven't looked at containerizing or put it in the cloud as yet.
Okay. And Ian's just commented on the thread and said Docker itself isn't supported into RHEL 8 or derivatives. You mean Podman, etc. And Chris has said, we don't run the IDP inside containers in prod, but the servers are built and managed via Puppet. We do use Vagrant with Puppet in dev. Yes, Vagrant's very good for things you want to run in dev.
In a previous role, I did experiment with managing our shib IDP config from within Puppet and doing it all in a nice declarative way. And I spent probably far too long trying to wrap my head around getting that all working, and decided that actually the way that we were doing it already, where we version controlled the XML files separately and shipped them out using Puppet, was a far more pragmatic approach. It is almost certainly possible to do, but I ran out of time, and we just stuck with the git manage, ship that, keep that in step using Puppet, but actually the files themselves are handcrafted. Particularly for the complexity of a big deployment. Simple deployments you can probably do, but the bigger ones which take on lots of things from all over the place.
The biggest step forward really is the metadata tagging based configuration support that was introduced in 3 probably, and has continued to be obviously supported. There was some cleanup done in v4. I don't think there's anything dramatically new in v4 related to that, but honestly, most of the things that I used to do with configuration files have since been moved to metadata based tags that drive the configuration wherever possible. So I used to have very, very long filter files and lots of relying party overrides and all kinds of rules of all sorts of various types. And all of that has pretty much been eliminated in favor of using entity attribute tags to to manipulate the settings at this point. So on any sort of day-to-day basis, it's really only metadata that I ever touch. It takes a while to get there, particularly if you have a messy, starting point, as a lot of people do. But it's really time well worth spending, because it will make it much easier to hand off to someone else when you finally decide to retire or move on to a different role. And it's just a lot easier to maintain, a lot less files to touch and things to deal with. So it really substantially improves life on a day-to-day basis.
So is this using the published entity categories, or is this your own entity categories?
Well, all of the property, all of the configuration settings for changing profile options are automatically, they're built-in entity attributes, essentially, that the system knows how to recognize. The attribute release stuff is somewhat more arbitrary, but there was a convention that we agreed to maintain, so that Unicon that was working on a GUI, there's actually a GUI for some of this that I won't really say a whole lot about because I've never used it, but it's designed in the same way. It basically deals with metadata only, and then assumes that all of the things that you can manipulate with the GUI are going to be handled by just shipping metadata into the IDPs. So you can do attribute release for the most part by just setting up rules that look for a tag for a particular attribute. So I essentially name the attributes inside the values of this particular entity attribute that I want to release to a particular system. And then I just have defaults that apply otherwise. So that takes a little more work to get going, but and is a little bit more style or more kind of arbitrary how you set it up, because you're kind of cooking up your own policies. But things like triggering MFA through setting the default authentication method property that you would normally be able to do with an override, you can just do with an entity attribute. And so I just have metadata filters and tags in my metadata for all the systems that I turn MFA on for, things of that nature. So we use it for, I'll probably do something similar for encryption when I start transitioning some things to GCM. I use it to drive which key to use to sign, so that I have all of the systems that don't support metadata locked to our existing keys, so that if we ever roll our key and change our default key again, only the systems that know how to deal with metadata will typically roll over to it and start signing with that key. All the others will be locked to the old one through an entity attribute that specifies what signing key to use. So there's various things that I used to use overrides for that are now gone. So we don't actually even have reloadability now in our configuration for anything but the filter file in terms of what automatically gets reloaded. And honestly, that's only historical. I almost never touch the filter file anymore, so it really wouldn't matter if I did. So other than updating metadata itself or occasionally reloading the metadata configuration, I really rarely touch any other parts of the configuration on a day-to-day basis.
Sounds good. I think a lot of people could probably reuse that sort of approach. So there's been a couple more comments in the chat. Andy's asked, I'll check, but we may look at the Debian-based distro. Is there a follow-up forum to this discussion anywhere? Probably not. Probably shib users, maybe, the JISC-mel list. That's probably the only natural place from this. I'm sure we can put the link into the chat for that. Robert said we use our own configuration management tools to generate and deploy attribute filter and other server config onto servers. And then Darren has pointed to the good starting point for Docker and containers is the Unicon shibboleth IDP Docker container.
Internet 2 has their own, of course. It's part of their what used to be tier and is now the TAP program. So they have another spin on it that probably has differences, and I'm assuming there are advantages and disadvantages over the Unicon one.
Alex has said that he uses the, oh, well, I haven't, yeah, it's a good starting point, the Unicom one. But yeah, you've mentioned the Internet 2 one as well. And the one that's a Dockerized IDP test beds has got IDP, SP, LDAP using a Docker Compose. Okay, we're at the hour.
Okay, thanks, John. Again, recording of this will be up on the Federation news site fairly soon. I think, you know, just carrying on this discussion can be done on just Shibboleth. I know we're going to be having a lunchtime session in about a month's time on general topics for the UK Federation, and I'm sure Shibboleth v.4 will feature in that. Tomorrow we've got Gesem Elsevier, Sari and Mark talking about single sign-on and how it can prevent piracy of content and other aspects of it, and I'll be talking about Verifid, which is the JISC's commercial verification service. So thank you everybody, and hopefully see many of you tomorrow.